All right, now let's take a closer look at what's at stake in today's primaries and this year's midterm elections with Steve Pruitt, managing partner of Watts Partners and former staff director of the Committee on the Budget in the United States House of Representatives. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, first of all, we have 8 states, including California and New Jersey, holding primaries Tuesday, and we're heading full swing now into the midterm election cycle. So explain to our international audience the significance of these primaries and the midterm elections.
Well, the primaries essentially narrow the number of candidates and ultimately give all of us a sense of what ideological leaning, if you will, the people in the country are starting to take. So far, the leaning has been clearly much more Democratic focused. We will see if that continues. I'm not one who necessarily is all ablaze about a Democratic wave. I think it's much too early to get a true read of that. But certainly coming out of these primaries and looking at November, the Democrats look like they're in a strong position to retake the House. I'm not as confident about the Senate. But either way, there's some things that looking forward after November that I think the international viewers will get a sense of through the primaries and certainly need to pay attention to after November.
So at this point then, being that this isn't a presidential election cycle, why should the rest of the world care what happens in the House and the Senate?
Well, it should care for 2 reasons. Number one, and I just alluded to the fact that after the election, there's going to be a change one way or the other in the ideology that is projected from our United States Congress, both the House and the Senate. Even if the Democratic wave happens, many of the Democrats that are going to be swept into office are more, if you will, conservative leaning, which means a lot of the anti-regulation push that we've seen, some of the other monetary concerns, trade is going to become a much greater issue. So I think that's going to be key. The Senate, I don't expect one way or the other, Democrat or Republican, the numbers of control to change significantly. So right. Don't expect anything radical there.
So let's look at the economic issues on the minds of voters for this upcoming election. What are their priorities?
Well, I think in many minds, jobs are still an issue. Even though our country right now has the lowest, quote unquote, unemployment so far in the history of the recorded data taking, that's not really what people are feeling at ground level.
Well, why is that?
Well, a lot of people, as economists point out, have stopped looking, which helps make that number look lower. Secondly, the flat or very slow growth in wages don't give people a whole lot to root for. And the lack of any real impact from last year's tax bill is not really playing well for certainly the Republicans, right. But individuals are not seeing it. $2 a week doesn't get it.
Now let's also look at what's happening with global trade. We've seen global markets rattled by a lot of these trade disputes that the US is having with some of its key allies and other trade partners. But how much does that matter to the voting public? Are they more worried? Is that on their radar versus what happens in their house? It is
clearly on people's radar today. Whether it will be on people's radar in November, I think is still an open question. But the way things are going right now, as these tariffs start to kick in, and quite frankly, the job losses that are certainly going to happen, plus the increases in prices that individuals are going to see in terms of buying their beer, their Coke, their canned goods, some of the dairy products, some of their meats that they like to enjoy at July 4th and Labor Day. Those are all going to come home to roost in terms of how the voters ultimately feel this coming November.
And so in terms of the key areas of concern that might happen between now and Election Day in November, what should we be keeping an eye on?
Well, I think number one, you need to keep an eye on what happens in the next 3-month period on taxes. There's been a lot of discussion about Congress going back and redoing another tax bill that would focus very intensely on individual tax relief so that they can boost the lack of benefit from the last bill for individuals. And unfortunately, because they're only talking about making the limited tax cuts that they did make last year permanent, it's still going to be a lowball issue for Republicans. Second thing I think they've got to watch, quite frankly, is what happens in terms of the regulatory push that the Trump administration has done. They've literally turned around about 90% of all the so-called executive order changes that President Obama was forced to make during his 8 years in office because of his inability to get legislation passed in Congress.
Right.
To do any more and do things that will somehow boost industry and other parts of our economy, they got to pass legislation. And right now, they're just not either getting leadership or certainly not presenting any proposals.
And November is certainly fast approaching. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Steve Pruitt, Managing Partner at Watts Partners.